are the light of this world. We are the salt of the earth. We've been called by His name to stand, in His name.
Welcome everybody. Welcome to hosted by Trevor and Christelle. Lovely to have you with us again. And we're really excited to have Aaron with us tonight, Aaron Ironside. And we were just chatting about it earlier. Aaron has a CV as long as my arm and my leg. And I would rather him introduce himself. And then we can get into some questions this evening. Welcome, Aaron. Really good to have you with us.
Yeah.
Honored to have you. We appreciate you being with us tonight.
Yes, thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure. Yeah, I'm joining you from Swanson, West Auckland, where we've been just, of course, at the end of nearly 3 months of lockdown. That has meant that I've not been able to do some of my day job, which is coordinating welfare for international seafarers at the Port of Auckland. But I have been able to continue my work as a counsellor, and of course, more recently have been hosting a new podcast with Family First called Active Intelligence.
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We spend some time listening to your podcasts.
Yes.
Lovely.
I appreciate that.
Really appreciate it. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your past, what you've done in the past to bring you to where you are.
It's been a checkered history. If you go back far enough, I was once an almost famous rock DJ in Auckland as one of the morning pirates of Radio Hauraki. But then after coming to faith, spent 20 years in Christian radio. I think I'm the only person who's ever held down a full-time on-air show on all three of the Rima media networks over the years. You start off when you're young at Life FM, and then when you have a family, you go to Rima, and then finally, when you're old enough, you go to Star, where Christian DJs go to die. So that's where I ended up. Haven't done any radio for a few years, though.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you being with us today. Today, we want to talk about social Marxism. I listened to your previous podcast on it. And, so I think we have been so influenced without even knowing about it, not being aware of it. And I think I really became aware of something the other day when I was discussing something online, and a young lady responded, and it just came out of nowhere. She said, "You obviously don't like that person because they are female." And so the whole identity, you identify. I think what's happening is people are looking at the issues of life through a screen of identity, which is a social restructure that we see.
Yeah, well, and of course...
Please,
I was going to say, the challenge, of course, is that structure has a home, has a kind of a worldview that it originates from, which essentially is what's called cultural Marxism or a social version of Marxism. Karl Marx, of course, was the founder of communism, and at the turn of the 20th century, it was Russia who really began the first big experiment with communism. At its most basic level, communism sounds quite appealing. I mean, this idea that everybody should share and have an equal amount of resource sounds like a nice kind of idea. And certainly Marx was concerned that ordinary workers did the hard work, but somebody else was getting rich. He didn't like the sound of that. And so created this idea of socialism or communism that Russia would try economically. Now, what we know, of course, is that it was a terrible failure on two fronts. It turns out that when everybody gets to have the same amount, that amount is very little, which is why, of course, the image of Russians standing in a long queue for a loaf of bread and living in terrible conditions became their reality. The other problem was, of course, that state-sanctioned sharing meant that there were those that didn't fancy sharing, or those who thought that sharing was a good idea, but it shouldn't be mandated by the government. And of course, communism's answer to that was to kill people. And so 100 million deaths later, we know that communism really hasn't worked. And what we're talking about today is the social or cultural reinvention of Marxism. And as you say, it's kind of everywhere in our world.
Yes, well, I think this is the thing. We're seeing it all over, and coming from different countries, we see that it's a universal thing. It's not just happening in one country. It is actually spreading throughout the Western world in a phenomenal way, and it's. I think the thing that concerns me is how that it seems to have infiltrated our educational systems.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's there. I mean, it's in every system. The home of the new kind of Marxism actually was in the 1940s in what's been now dubbed the Frankfurt School. Interestingly, some Jewish thinkers in Germany were fascinated to note that Germany, for example, didn't follow Russia's lead, didn't say, let's try communism. And so they reinvented the communist thought. And the bit that they really zoned in on was the idea of power. And this kind of notion that power is sort of implicit in some people. If you're in a certain gender, you have power. A certain colored skin, you have power. And therefore, by definition, people with a different gender or a different color skin did not have power. And so consequently, cultural Marxism now has this agenda to destroy power structures. But of course, the things that are deemed to be power structures these days are not economic, but social. And of course, the biggest one that we are seeing in this particular day and age is gender, where gender is seen as a power structure that needs to be dismantled. And so consequently, we're seeing an attempt to destroy the idea of boy and girl, male and female, and instead to introduce notions of, I've lost count now, over 70 different gender identities. And so that becomes a big group. And of course, the other group is race, where essentially what Marxism and cultural Marxism trades on is identity politics, group identity. It doesn't matter that you're Aaron. What matters is that you're white and male. It just matters what group you belong to. And as you say, now power is seen everywhere. Simply by being white, I'm accused of being implicitly racist. By being male, implicitly misogynist. And that cultural Marxism wants to destroy those things. And whilst there are probably some things that need to be destroyed, I think most of us can see that they're going way too far beyond common sense.
I think what I've experienced, our youngest daughter is in Auckland at university. Well, she just finished her degree, and what she said is, the general young person is believing in the ideology of this cultural reformation because their hearts are that they want to be kind. They believe that this cultural reformation that is being preached with this ideology of social Marxism is the kind way, is the, we're not excluding anybody. We're not, like you say, there's no power structures anymore. A society with no religion is good because religion is an exclusive way of looking at people. So what they are being taught is that this is the utopia. This is going to be, we're all going to love each other, and not just, like you say, economically, that nobody suffers, we all suffer together, but that there's no pointing fingers. There's no, oh, but I'm a Christian and you a Muslim, or they want this no structured society. And the young people are endorsing it because it sounds so good. It sounds so good.
Well, exactly. And of course, you're punished. The irony here is that in this culture supposedly built on kindness and tolerance, that kindness and tolerance is only extended to those who agree. Of course, this is the same group that will just as quickly cancel your career if you post the wrong thing on Facebook. In my next episode of Active Intelligence, I speak with a Melbourne doctor who has been stood down by the Medical Association for comments he made on his Facebook page and on a Christian blog about his thoughts around gender identity, even though he's done nothing wrong in terms of his job. He's had no complaints as a doctor. He's a well-regarded doctor. He's lost his career. So funnily enough, it turns out that kindness is about the last thing you get if you don't agree. And unfortunately, it has led to an incredibly divisive experience for most of us. I don't know about you guys, but certainly I find in social media, it's harder and harder to enjoy the experience of relating to others because we have become more divisive than ever. So if there is some utopia that's promised, it hasn't appeared yet.
And the labeling. I mean, it's because everybody is identified in one way or the other. I've often found if I see a discussion and somebody makes a comment, they'll immediately be relegated to something. You are either a baby boomer or you're a this or you're that or the next thing. So we can categorize you and then just ship you off because you don't understand. You don't have the intelligence that we do. We don't. And so, and yet everybody's saying the same thing. Everybody's singing from the same book. And so I've been so interested in reading so many of the comments on that. And sometimes the most radical comments that I've read have been from professors teaching at educational institutions.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, well, these ideas, of course, have filtered down now from the university down into the high school. And as you say, they're taken as givens by our young people, perhaps also because in the same trend in the opposite direction, they've been less exposed to other thoughts. We've kicked out the Bible in schools people from our schools. We've said you're not able to entertain other ways of seeing the world. And so consequently, when you're given one version and everybody around you seems to accept it, you just take it as writ.
Yeah.
It's as if people are losing their critical thinking skills.
Yeah. Oh, look, they really are. And in fact, of course, trying to engage them will invoke this kind of groupthink where the group basically tells you that's not what we think, which is the kind of the biggest version of this kind of identity politics. This group identity is the groupthink that follows, that you're only allowed to believe what the group believes. And of course, once the group has declared its position, you'd be foolish to oppose them because we can see that the cancel culture, the shaming, the aggression that follows, for most people, it just simply isn't worth it.
Yeah. Now, Marxism wasn't rooted in atheism. Marxism was actually rooted in anti-God.
Yeah, sure.
And this is something that, because Marxism and socialism is becoming more and more accepted, more and more young people are, well, socialism aren't, and of course Marxism is just a step from socialism, and we can see that there are so many Christian young people that have been taught in the system who seem to think that way now. And how do you see a biblical worldview as opposed to a social Marxist worldview?
Well, we can see in a sense that there's some things about the teachings of Jesus that appear in this worldview that we can acknowledge and affirm. The care and concern for the poor. Well, that's right throughout the Bible. People who love God do love the poor because the one who gives to the poor lends to God. It's certainly a case that the concern for those who find themselves born into poverty and in difficult situations is there. I think the difference, of course, is that
Yes.
the Christian response to poverty comes from within. It's the desire to serve and to care. But this worldview doesn't mind if you don't care. It doesn't really want you to care, need you to care. It just needs you to obey. And because it's government mandated, it doesn't come with it that same attitude, that same spirit of the Christian whose heart has been changed, who finds a concern, an affection, a desire to help. Now, I'm not saying that it's not there in some people who hold to this worldview, but the worldview doesn't need that. What it needs is compliance, and it trades in compliance. And I'd say the big difference is that Christianity is about power with. It's about me using my power to work with others, to help them. But this worldview is power over others. It requires others to give up their power, to surrender their power. And the irony is, in this regard, it needs people to remain victims. Because in that respect, if those who are currently classified as victims were to ever shake free of that, well, the system wouldn't know what to do with that. It trades on the fact, for example, that if you have dark skin, you're forever a victim. And if you have white skin, you're forever an oppressor. And ultimately, the irony here is that we're trying to defeat racism with racism, because if your accusation is that all white people are implicitly racist, well, that's a racist thought.
Yes.
And it requires for all black people to be implicitly victims. And there are plenty of people of color who've made a great deal of their life who don't want to play by these rules, who want to say, who are you kidding? I'm nobody's victim. I'm able to make something of myself. And so I think this is the point at which the two paths start to separate from each other, because again, we see in the Christian worldview is this kind of desire to, in a sense, take those gifts, those blessings, those opportunities, and to make something of them. This system actually requires people to stay victimized the entire time. It really doesn't want them to ever not be a victim.
And yet, I mean, through Jesus, healing comes. I mean, that's why he came. He came to heal. He came to deliver. He came to set free. He came to bring us into a relationship with someone that we call Father. And he loves us as his children. And so to me the contradiction or the different worldviews is that God is a father who loves his children, and it's a family orientated religion where identity is of paramount importance. Where in this worldview we want to try and strip away identity, where we all just become the same.
Well, it is an ironic kind of world, because on the one hand, if you're female or born a person of color, somehow your body matters, at least for a moment. But then now, just as quickly, they want to dismantle that and say, actually, how you identify is all that matters, how you think of yourself, which, of course, destroys the entire notion of identity. And, of course, in that regard, means that we have to defy just what is obvious common sense to anyone who can observe that, yes, some attributes of being male, like, I don't know, playing with trucks, that might be more of a social construct. But we know actually that the presence of testosterone means that males are more likely to be confident and more likely to be aggressive. So we see more examples of conflict among men than we do among women. Estrogen, we know, is more likely to bring about more nurturing and relational behaviors. Our bodies are real things, and our bodies are part of what make us ourselves. And so this idea that actually your sexual identity, your sexual orientation and your gender identity, your soji, is all that matters about you, when there's lots that matters about you. And of course, part of who you're made to be shapes your experience of what it means to be human.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Our value and our worth is, first of all, that we are created. Every person born in this world created in the image of God, and that our value is that we are human beings. It doesn't matter, where we come from and what we look like. But it's an interesting. It's a radical. I enjoyed your interview and where you said on your podcast, and that I think it was that doctor, I forget her name now, from ACL in Australia, the
Elizabeth Taylor.
Elizabeth Taylor. And was it her who said it's a radical social experiment and nobody knows where this is going to take us, really?
No, we don't know where it's going to go, but all the signs are not in a good place, because ultimately the things that we need as anchors for reality that help us navigate life are being stripped away from us, but nothing is being offered in its place, and certainly nothing that's superior. And I know that, in my children's, I have young adult children, in their world are people who are struggling with gender identity, and not one of them is thriving as a person. So it's incredibly difficult to watch drug addiction and mental illness plague these poor young people who are desperately wanting to find acceptance. I'm thinking of one particular young lady who's decided that she does not have any sexual identity, that she is kind of gender neutral. Now, what's fascinating, I've known this young lady now living as a they, so I'm not even entirely sure what the appropriate pronoun is anymore. But I know that when she was living as a girl, she wasn't very popular socially. She was a nerd. She was kind of on the outer of social things. And yet, the decision to live in this new identity meant that suddenly people were applauding her. You're so brave. You're so courageous. And suddenly she was experiencing a form of acceptance and connection that had been absent from her world. So I certainly understand where the appeal comes from, because often young people who are experiencing rejection and feeling misunderstood for the first time are being applauded. But I tell you what, if she ever decides that she'd like to go back to being a girl, she won't be applauded then. Then she'll be despised worse than ever.
And that's why the church is here. The church is here to bring hope, isn't it? To bring healing and deliverance.
Absolutely. And I think that this is where the church, if the church is going to reform in response to this, we've got to keep dialing up community, because it is in genuine community where you are celebrated for who you are, not who you think you should be, that healing begins to come. But if you have to keep recreating yourself in your own image, in your own thought, then it's going to be an elusive goal to try and find an identity that is going to be one that nurtures you long term. I mean, this young lady I've been talking about, eventually her friends will stop applauding her. Eventually she'll just have to work out, how do you navigate life without a gender, without any of those markers? How are you going to find love and relationships? How are you going to fit into your world? Nobody's thinking about these things that are down the line. This is where the church has an incredible opportunity. Sadly, the church has spent too much time wagging fingers at young people who just want to be loved, just want to be known. And they've assumed the church has nothing they need, because the church has been the most vocal in terms of telling them that, well, you're wrong and you're silly and, this is foolishness. And of course, then they're like, well, I don't want anything to do with you or your God. Now, interestingly, I think this means as Christians also is that gone are the days, on the one hand, we have to be these community people. On the other, we cannot afford now to be apolitical, because on the street today in New Zealand, the number one reasons people are not considering Jesus are the church's attitudes towards issues around gender identity, all the stuff we're talking about tonight. So we've got to learn to navigate this head on, but I think it starts with learning afresh how to love people where they are, not where we would like to see them finally end up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The church needs to start love in action. really loving, obeying the new commandment, the new covenant law of love, the 1 Corinthians 13 kind of love, not the love that wants to force people to conform to what I think is right, but loving them. I always think about it. It's not God's judgment that brings us to repentance. It's God's love for us that brings us to the place of, Lord, I need you, and I need you in my life. And I think it's true what you say. We can't be apolitical. We can't stay away from these discussions, but we do need to come from the place of loving people, because it's when people are in that lost position, in that victim position, that they are easier to be controlled by cultural Marxism, social Marxism.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Because they are confused. They're in a confused place, or if you have a victim mentality, you cannot have critical thinking, or you cannot take control of your situation, because you don't know what to do and who you are and where to go, and somebody else is making the decisions for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, there's so many challenges await us, but there's certainly, back to your comment referring to Elizabeth Taylor's comment that this is a social experiment. The other side of that is, I think in part we have to let the experiment play out. Whilst we know intuitively and by experience now that the results are unlikely to be good, the experiment has not run its course either. And I don't think it will be for another 10 or maybe even 20 years before finally the culture will say, this is ridiculous. Now, you made a comment earlier about young people are swallowing this hook, line, and sinker, and I'm not sure it's always as true as we think. In the extended grouping of my young adult children is someone they know who's living as a woman but was born a man, born so much of a man that she now lives in a 6'3" body. So she is quite significantly taller than her boyfriend. And I remember my son telling me the story about how this person was having a domestic violence sort of episode with her boyfriend. And then my son said this, and then she remembered that she was a 6'3" man. And she really got stuck into him. Like, in other words, my son knows deep down that whilst he's happy to call this lady by the name she wishes to be known, he knows that she's not really a woman. He knows that she's actually a 6'3" man trying to live as a woman. And I'm not sure that the culture really, the young people have bought everything as deeply as we suspect they have. I think there are some who realize the emperor is naked but aren't willing to stand up and say anything yet.
No, absolutely. Because cancel culture is real. And as soon as you do stand up against what is preached, then you become labeled. And everybody wants to be an individual. Nobody wants to be picked out of the group.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I do think that the culture kind of knows. We've certainly seen that even this year with the Olympics and Laurel Hubbard. In a sense, Laurel did us all a favor by not actually winning a medal, because deep down people were very suspicious of that. But you can see this is actually where this is probably going to come apart at the seams. The most likely thing to destroy the Marxism won't be Christianity, it'll be feminism. Because feminism is deeply offended by this social Marxism. Feminism that has said women, people born in a female body, deserve to be treated well and equally, and yet the Otago University awards Laurel Hubbard, someone born a man, Woman of the Year, Woman Athlete of the Year. Well, feminists are not going to stand for this in the end, because they're not going to put up with men coming in dressed as women to claim their rightful place in the sporting pantheon, in the culture itself. I think it's most likely that feminism is going to actually be the one that takes cultural Marxism down.
Well, if I
Yeah,
look
it's
at
interesting. Yeah.
if I look at the different countries where communism and these ideologies have run its course, it takes a season for the people to be disillusioned and for the result of these things to play. And so we are, you're only starting to see the effects in society now here in New Zealand. And like you said, it's going to take 10 or 15 or 20 years for us to see the results of this. And people are going to, I don't want to say wake up, but realize the effects of the ideology only when it's running its course. At this stage, I don't think everybody understands the implication that it will have on the family, on the person, the individual, the family unit, and the nation.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make, because I think most Kiwis have been fairly open-minded about this on the basis of, well, whatever you do in your home, in your bedroom, that's really none of my business. But the problem is this is coming into the public space now. Now we're talking about sending our daughters to schools where somebody in that changing room having a shower was born a male. And we have stories of unfortunately, of abuse happening in exactly those scenarios. So it isn't a case that you can just say, oh, well, whatever you do at home is your business, doesn't affect me. This stuff is going to affect us. And the other one is simply this, that the cultural Marxism and the dismantling of gender, for example, wants to say that we are now all on the spectrum. So in other words, gender is no longer binary. It's no longer two options, male or female, but rather a spectrum of which we're all on the spectrum. In other words, we're all transgender in some form or another. We just haven't found ourselves on the continuum. And ultimately, that kind of stuff is going to affect ordinary people, because now it's not just what you think about yourself in your house. You're now requiring me to think a certain way about myself. And of course, we've seen this already in terms of the battle around pronouns. It's interesting. I watched a video recently that made me smirk, because I realized it isn't pronouns. I'm surprised that the transgender community is concerned about pronouns, because surely it's adjectives are the types of words they should really try and control. Because really, calling someone she because they wish to be called a she is irrelevant if the words that follow she are unkind. Surely adjectives are far more important than pronouns to police. But whether it's pronouns or whether it's adjectives, the point is, it's no longer happening in the private space. Now you and I are required to conform. We're required to speak a certain way, irrespective of what we think or believe. And no longer is it about what you believe about you as an individual. You now require me to believe it too. And frankly, that's where this has gone too far. And of course, it's where it causes the most divisive conflict, is because suddenly we're requiring other people to have to call the world a certain way, when frankly, you can't police my thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. And I think that's an important thing. An entirely new language has been created. So often people will speak about something, and being old school, you will imagine that they mean what you are used to that word or that phrase meaning. But it's totally different now. Can you give us some examples of and how to identify language?
Well, and that's a great point. And I think Elizabeth Taylor makes some excellent points in the podcast around this, where she says if you're not allowed to use the words male and female, or they no longer mean what they used to mean, then we cannot have a discussion about it. That what happens is that words either open up the possibility for thought or they shut it down. If you can't describe something, if you have no language for it, it's very hard to think about it. It's even harder to talk to others about it. So I think we can see where the obvious kind of language is occurring, particularly gender identity has been the one that has been very confusing for many of us to try and get our head around. I mean, even if we just simply wish to be polite and use whatever pronoun somebody wishes for us to use, trying to then do the mental gymnastics of, well, I don't want to get it wrong, and it's just an absolute minefield. But I think the bigger issue becomes that we are unable, therefore, to think and to speak about these things, and therefore also unable to celebrate what is good about those things. Because now we're saying that male and female are just kind of ideas, that they're not actually things, which means you can't celebrate them. You can't celebrate a male feat of strength as being that, because, well, being male apparently is just a thought. It's not connected to any reality. And now ultimately, of course, this disrupts our capacity to even think about reality at all. And of course, this is why we now have examples of this that's gone too far. People who wish to be married to their dog or identify as a child when they are an adult, because ultimately, once the rules of reality are disbanded, well, really, who could say you're not allowed to identify in that way? Now, we know that those examples are rare and extreme, but they remind us of what happens when we lose our ability to think and to have dialogue, and therefore to make real progress.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I think the call for the church, as we said before, is to love, but to also be informed. You know, we can no longer have this position of sitting and watching the world go by and doing the things that the world around us is doing, and the society is being restructured, and we sit in our safe bubble saying, well, it's not affecting me. I think there really is a call for the church and conservative people of conservative values to be informed and to have that critical thinking, and, as you said so well, to have these discussions, but in a loving way. You know, the church we need to be known as loving people first and foremost, isn't it?
Well, that's right. And I think that's the attitude, Sheik. It's the way we go about the conversation. You know, we know in evangelism, it's the difference between almost looking gleeful about pointing out somebody else's sin versus being moved with tears in your eyes about their eternal plight. You know, how you feel about others really changes the way you communicate your concerns. I think what we want to do is point out to people, in a sense, the folly of it. But I'm reminded of this couplet of Proverbs in Proverbs 25. They sound like they are opposites, because you have to work out when to apply which one. One says, don't answer a fool according to his folly, lest you become a fool. The other one says, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he become wise in his own eyes. And we have to learn now the nuance, the wisdom of navigating those two proverbs. On the one hand, to realize there are plenty of moments where us speaking will make us the fool. We're just going to waste an hour, waste an evening, destroy a friendship for no real good reason. But then there are these other times where we realize, you know what? I can't let that comment go unchallenged. I'm going to have to speak up, because I do not wish that person to think that my silence is an affirmation of that they are wise in their own eyes. And I tell you, it takes the wisdom of Solomon to work out which is the moment for applying which of those proverbs. I'm reminded deeply of a story that the rabbis tell. They tell the story of a man who walks among Sodom and Gomorrah with a sign that says, repent. And after many years, some of his friends say to him, why do you bother carrying the sign around that says repent? Clearly nobody's listening. Clearly nobody's really repenting. He said, yeah, when I first started carrying the sign around, I was hopeful that people would repent. But in the end, I carry the sign around to remind me not to join in.
So good.
Yeah. So I think, just to wrap it up, we need to be able to identify what is actually contrary to our biblical worldview. And for that, we need to be informed. And that's why we're so grateful for you being with us
Thank
today. We
you.
appreciate that, Aaron. Then we need to be so conscious of the fact that Jesus came for everyone. Jesus came, and as Christelle said earlier, he didn't come to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. And that is our vision, and that is our purpose. Our purpose is to bring people to Christ, regardless of their belief system at the moment, and then to operate in grace and love and be a place of healing. And I really think that's what we want. We really want to see the hand of God move in this nation and in every nation, obviously, but it's gonna happen through a body of people operating in the spirit of grace and love and wanting to see people being healed, reconciled to Christ. Thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate you being with us, spending the time. We'd love to have you again sometime.
Be a pleasure. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Aaron. Thank you. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.